It has been an absolute honour and privilege to serve as a trustee of NISA alongside you, other trustees and the governors, and indeed our broader stakeholder group that has also been extremely supportive through these hard times, but in an endeavour that we all share a really strong passion in. It's an equally large honour and privilege to be welcoming all of you to the post-AGM presentation and discussion by NISA. This has become a bit of a tradition, and normally we'd be having a nice glass of wine and, you know, chatting to each other and getting into the festive mood. Sadly, this year we're doing it via Zoom, but it's nevertheless a huge delight to see so many friendly faces and familiar faces, despite them being on the Zoom screen rather than in person. It feels very appropriate in what has been another turbulent week, I would say, to be returning to a topic that's actually quite evergreen. The UK has had a persistent productivity problem, and now COVID is doing interesting things to both the supply and demand side of the economy. And it will be really interesting and great to hear from both the sort of macro, if I put it broadly, and the micro side of NISA, because productivity is also a topic where macro and micro really have to merge and contribute different perspectives in order to really understand what's going on. And the policy responses are critical. And it's, of course, as Judgit has already said, an area where NISA has a lot to say. We are extremely lucky to have both of NISA's current deputy directors, Paul and Adrian, who I'll introduce in a minute, presenting to us tonight. They will give us their presentation. We will have some time at the end for questions and answers. But given that we're running a little bit late, we'll see how it goes. Probably try still to finish past the hour, but if there's a lot of conversation, of course, there's no need to immediately drop off. But I think I want to give Paul and Adrian the time to share their thoughts with us, and feel free also to put any Q&A into the chat, which we will be monitoring as we go through. So Paul, as you've already heard, has been enormously helpful to NISA in the last couple of months by joining as an interim deputy director to lead the macro side. He has had a distinguished career in multiple official institutions, including the IMF and the Bank of England, but also in the private sector at BNP Paribas in New York. He is very frequently quoted in print and interviewed in broadcast media, and has published various things, and indeed done very important work for the House of Commons, especially on topics to do with financial markets, the global economy, monetary policy, emerging markets and cryptocurrency. So all the topics that are really hot at the moment from a macro perspective. Alongside Paul, we'll hear from Adrian Pabst, who after his PhD from Cambridge has focused his research really on the intersection of political economy, political theory and public policy. So no better person to be commenting on where we're at the moment in the economic circumstances. And Adrian has published lots in very serious economic journals, including the International Review of Economics. Adrian is a massively prolific author, both of essays and of books. Most recently has contributed to essays on the political economy and the Eurozone, has published books called Blue Labour and Post-Liberal Politics, and continues to work on new books, including a monograph entitled The Constitution of Political Economy. So I can't think of any better people to give us a really interesting and rich perspective around what's happening to productivity post-COVID than both Paul and Adrian. And I can't wait to see what they've got to say. So let me hand over to Paul and Adrian, and we'll come back to Q&A after. Thank you.
Paul, you're muted. Yeah, thanks, Tara. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for the warm words from Sir Paul. Very much appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be working at NISA, which I've always held in the highest regard for very many years, from when I worked at the bank for Christopher Dow, who actually sat in my chair many years ago. It's a pleasure to work with Adrian and Jadjit, as I said. So productivity in the face of COVID. What I want to do is to look at a number of factors, the aggregate picture, look at the sectors, talk a little bit about firm creation and destruction, which will lead into furlough, and contrast maybe the productivity experience of the US with that in the UK so far, and then talk about capital scarring, where I'm considerably more pessimistic than the OBR, for example. And finally, I want to ask some policy questions that I'd love to hear your view on where we're going. So if we look at the what happened normally in a cycle, productivity goes in the same direction as output. It goes when output falls, productivity falls, because some employees are labor as a quasi-fixed factor. That didn't happen in this cycle. What we saw was that things moved in different directions. They moved in the same direction. Output fell and productivity went up during 2020. So there were big sectoral differences if we move forward. Manufacturing did particularly well. Normally, manufacturing would do badly because it would be one of the most cyclical sectors. It would hold on to its labor, output would fall a lot, and productivity growth would be pretty miserable. That didn't happen this time. And what happened with furlough, as we'll see later, is the furlough scheme encouraged people to get rid of their least, or lay off their least productive workers. So on this chart, the highest skill level are the green bars. So you can see in every case, the green bars, this is the percentage of staff furloughed at any time during the pandemic. The most highly skilled were least likely to be laid off. So you laid off the least skilled, the most unproductive people, and so productivity went up. And you can see that the rates of furlough varied enormously differently. Accommodation and food services, almost 70% of staff were laid off at one time or another, and some of the other sectors were barely half of that. So when we look at the sectoral distribution, we can see that finance stands out. Finance did pretty badly amongst the private sector sectors, and this is a worry. You know, finance was one of our most productive sectors, but keeps getting hit. It was hit by the global financial crisis, in particular the narrowing of the interest margin that banks earn, and arguably it's been hurt by QE on that basis. It's clearly been suffering from Brexit, and it's suffered again from COVID. So there's an issue here longer term about, do we need to do something about finance and insurance, because it's one of our most productive sectors, and while its productivity is performing badly, the overall economy is going to struggle, I think. So productivity in non-market services, sorry, you can't see the education one, it seems to be off the edge, I apologize for that, but it shows a similar picture to health, that productivity was very poor, that health, perhaps surprisingly, hours went up, even though GVA, gross value added, went down. But these sorts of services did pretty badly. When we look at what happened overall, you can see that in 2008, 2009, the little black dot shows the average in each case. Productivity went down during the recession, and in the 2020 recession, productivity went up. And so one of the things that was unusual, which you've already mentioned, is the little burgundy bar, manufacturing productivity improved, but there was also a reallocation away from the least productive sectors. So some of the least productive sectors in the UK, things like hotels and restaurants, accommodation, personal services, and those were hit. So ours there fell very sharply, and that enabled the better productivity performance overall. So let's talk about businesses and business creation. So when we look at what the dynamics of productivity in economy, often held to be important, creative destruction is the age-old phrase, which means that economies, we know that small new firms tend to create a lot of employment. They happen to be low productivity in the early years, but that picks up later. So what's happened to the rate of business creation and destruction in the UK? Now, these figures look incredibly helpful. It says there are lots of businesses created, including in things that maybe are quite surprising that were heavily hit by COVID, such as accommodation and wholesale and retail trade. I do not trust these numbers one little bit, because it's quite clear that the incidence of fraud over the furlough scheme was quite high. There were 5 addresses in London, 5 alone, that were responsible for 7,000 new business registrations in 2020. It's clear that people set up new businesses, didn't have any employees or hired them and immediately laid them off and claimed furlough for a long period. And the Inland Revenue have been informed of over 30,000 such cases. The data on business closures may be more interesting and more informative about what's been happening to productivity. So if we can go forward to the next chart, we can see that company insolvencies plunged once the first lockdown came. And of course, furlough was the twin of lockdown. You couldn't have lockdown without furlough. It was impossible. You couldn't put businesses to the wall. It wouldn't have happened. So you had to have furlough. And what appears to have happened is that that kept effectively a lot of zombie businesses going. Businesses that would otherwise have collapsed in normal times were kept going by their furlough payments. Moreover, because there was a need to reallocate resources away from services towards goods, that didn't really happen. So we ossified the employment structure to a degree. Ours fell, but those employees stayed attached to the firms where they worked. The rise in insolvencies in the latest quarter, towards the end of the furlough period, again, I'm not sure I totally trust those numbers. It's what you would have expected, but are these bogus companies that are just being wound up? And that's the only reason I looked at the bogus companies, to try and put this chart in some perspective. So did furlough damage productivity growth? Well, what we looked at here was productivity per hour indexed on 2019 Q4 for the US and UK. And the UK productivity is exactly where it was in 2019 Q4. In contrast, the US is 2.8% higher. And what they experienced was a great deal of job loss and then a great deal of rehiring, often not in the same industries. So they seem to have been more efficient in reallocating labor. We know very much that there has been a shift away from services and towards goods. It's extreme in the US. The purchases of durables in the US are now nearly 25% higher than they were at the end of 2019 Q4. Purchases of services are still lower. There has been that reallocation in the UK, but not to such a big degree. So let's talk about the long-term effects of scarring. Now, the ONS said that they thought capital scarring was about 1.5%, which is the cumulative loss of investment during the pandemic so far. When we looked at it, we thought there were a number of different channels. That was one of them. The fact that firms expect future output to be lower is another. We do think there will be write-offs and accelerated depreciation. And you can see in the chart that when we have a bad recession, depreciation rates seem to rise afterwards. And then there's a question of the capital being locked up in the wrong sector, and we'll come back to it. And then finally, there's uncertainty and risk premium. Think of yourself making an investment in a small business. Would you invest in a restaurant today? Would you invest in a leisure facility? If you did, I would bet that your hurdle rate of return would be considerably higher than it would have been back in 2019, because you need to be compensated for the perceived extra risk. And I think I've seen some figures from one of the Federal Reserve banks that put a huge number on this that I didn't believe, but I think it's a neglected form of capital scarring. We're in a more uncertain world. People will be more reluctant to invest. And then there's duplication. Because of interruption of supply chains, you build a plant in the UK and perhaps in Asia. You want a duplication, but that doesn't add to output because some of that is standing idle. And then finally, if we look at our forecasts, what we find is that business investment is poor compared with where it was in 2019 in our forecast, but housing investment is much better. So once again, the use case seems to be going down the route of let's invest in housing rather than in productive business investment. And I think that's a neglected scarring effect of the pandemic. So just to talk about capital shortage by sectoral reallocation. This just looks at the net productive capital output ratio, currently the ONS, and then the output change between the fourth quarter of 2019 and the first quarter of this year. And you know what you see, two of the sectors we've identified where demand and output is lower, and unless we get rid of COVID, which I doubt we're going to do anytime soon, will stay around. Private non-traded services and financial services are kind of low capital output ratio industries, and we're going to have to move to industries that have higher capital output ratios. So it means capital's in the wrong place and there's not enough of it. Effectively, if we move away from service industries towards more manufacturing, we're going to need more capital. So there's a capital shortfall. Again, I think that's a form of capital scarring. So how much are we talking about? If we turn to the next slide, I'll give you my guesses. I come up with 3.5% to 6.5%. And when we talked to the OBR about these before the budget, they thought they were pretty big. And I think they are big. I was quite surprised when I came out with them myself. But let's just think, is 3.5 that unreasonable? So let's think about how we think about the output gap. How do we know that the output gap's closed? And the answer is when we start seeing inflation picking up. Well, we are seeing inflation picking up. So it does look as though the output gap is more or less closed in the UK. And we know that output's still below the level at the end of 2019 Q4. And that trend growth is about 1.4% per annum. So broadly speaking, we're about 3% short of where we should have been in terms of capacity. And we're seeing that we're at full capacity. So that says something like 3 for capital scarring is not just made up from numbers that are guesses, they're guesstimates, but also consistent with what's happening on the price side, I think. And that's worrying because that shortfall in the capital stock is impeding how fast this economy can grow. We're seeing that. That's what supply shortages are. It tells you there's not enough capital to grow this economy. So I think capital scarring is quite big. So if we try and sum up, productivity is now no better than it was 2 years ago. So COVID's made the UK productivity problem worse. effectively, the coronavirus job support scheme was a low productivity job support scheme. And the question is, should we support jobs or should we support incomes? Should we have made more effort for sectoral to promote sectoral reallocation than we did? What we did effectively at CGRS was pay people to keep economic activity, to keep employees locked up in industries where demand was moving away. And we didn't allow a reallocation. And that's maybe one reason why we're still below the Q4 2019 GDP level. There are big concerns about capital scarring. And my feeling is we need to do much more about reallocating capital. Capital looks, because we're a service-based economy, we're particularly susceptible to COVID, which affects services. And we need to move away from that and to reallocate capital. The question I'd have for you is, how do we do that? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And we'll move straight on to Adrian. And then please keep thinking about questions and answers and also put them in the chat if you have any.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tara, for your more than generous words of introduction earlier. And thank you also to everyone for joining this evening. I think productivity is one of those examples of where macro and the public policy areas overlap and where the two teams really work very closely together. And it's been a real pleasure working with Paul over the last few months. Some of the issues I want to touch upon in my remarks are trade and foreign direct investment, the digital divide, education and skills, and very briefly at the end on industrial policy and governance and institutions, with just a mention of some of our work on regional regeneration. This is, of course, a work of a team, and so I want to also put on record my thanks to colleagues in my team for their work. We have for some time published our regional economic analysis in every of the quarterly UK economic outlook. So you can see chapter 1 is on the UK economy as a whole, the macro picture that Paul has just outlined, and then chapter 2 of that outlook is the regional picture that we have worked on. And really on productivity in the regions, I think we can identify, broadly speaking, 3 gaps. There's a finance gap in local and regional capital markets. There's a skills gap in the labour market, and there's also gaps in our institutional ecology and the policy landscape. And really, I want to just come back to those 3 gaps as I go along. The first thing to say, though, is we are seeing some both existing and widening disparities as a result of COVID. I think it was in 1976 when the Chinese premier was asked what thought about the French Revolution of 1789. And I think the answer was, it's too soon to say. Well, with COVID, it's too soon to give definitive answers, but we can already see certain patterns. One such pattern is labour productivity in the regions, where you can see that both before, during and after the worst of the COVID shock, there are some enormous disparities, with London way ahead of the rest of the United Kingdom. And that includes not only regions across England, whether it's the Midlands or indeed the North, but also the 3 devolved nations of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And unfortunately, there aren't currently any signs that those regional disparities in labour productivity terms are narrowing. And the picture is similar if we look at it in terms of our NISA forecast. So here you can see 2019 before the pandemic, 2020, the first year, and our projections currently for 2024. Those very deep regional disparities, with London and the Southeast way ahead, do not look like they are going to narrow anytime soon. Though we would also say that nothing is written in stone, and the right institutional and policy interventions can deliver some really important productivity improvements between now and 2024. Just briefly on trade, I mean, obviously it's very hard to disentangle the effects of COVID on both trade and productivity from those of Brexit. In some sense, the two shocks have coincided in temporal terms, but they are quite different in terms of their nature. We know that there's a sort of selection effect where the frontier firms trade, and that clearly helps with productivity, and also learning by exporting effect, where firms that begin to export also experience higher productivity growth. But for us, what's of particular interest is also the regional distribution of investment flows. And we can see here that certain regions and sectors within them benefit a lot more than others. Unfortunately, for the moment, that again is adding to the existing disparities. We're not really picking up signs so far that trade is helping to boost productivity growth in other parts of the United Kingdom more than in London. Obviously, we want London to do well and we want the Southeast to do well, but they are at the moment doing a lot better than the rest of the country. The links between FDI and productivity are even stronger than between trade and productivity. We can see here where inward FDI is happening and which parts are benefiting. It is the Southeast, including London. That's where most of the FDI projects are, unsurprisingly, but that is the reality. Scotland is also doing quite well as parts of the Northwest, but not others, as you can see. Now, it's very clear that the more affluent regions are the ones that keep on reaping the benefits of foreign direct investment and job creation, even if they also took a quite a large hit during the worst of the pandemic. Now, when we come to digitalization and the digital divide, I think there's a number of things that are interesting. This is just a brief sort of depiction of where the UK is in relation to, you can see the EU and individual member states of the EU. UK does very well in terms of individuals making purchases. You know, it's the leading country in the EU. 90% of people buy online, very high volumes and so on. Of course, we saw that increase over COVID with, tech platforms doing incredibly well, your Amazons, your Deliveroos and so on. Also the population, the percentage of the population using e-banking is high in the United Kingdom, though there are countries where it's even higher, such as Denmark or Sweden. Also doing quite well in terms of selling through e-commerce, less well purchasing through e-commerce, and then really not so well in terms of employees with access to the internet. And that is really interesting. That's the story we are telling in terms of the digital divide. And it's also worth saying that if we hope that the kind of acceleration in the adoption of digital technologies will help productivity, we must also remember that so far the empirical evidence is rather scant. Yes, it helps, but maybe not to the extent that some of us hoped. So a 10% increase in the country's share of firms using high-speed broadband is associated with only a 1.4% increase in total factor productivity after 1 year and 6% after 5 years. So the effects are not enormous, right? And for cloud computing, it's about 1% after a year and 3.5% after 5 years. So, yes, digitalization is really important. The divide is real. We must address it. But we also mustn't hope that this will somehow solve the UK's poor productivity performance. A lot more is required. Significant investment in data networks and digital infrastructure, of course, because we can see that the disparities, again, are broadly aligned with what we've seen. Certain companies and households in certain parts of the countries do well. Certain regions and sectors do well and others do not. But we need a lot more than that. I mean, just to say, in London, 3/4 of premises have access to ultra-fast broadband. In Wales, it's only 1/3. So there are some enormous differences, disparities. And so better access to broadband and digital devices is needed, but also we need to improve people's skills, digital skills, and that has to involve schools, colleges, governments, businesses and trade unions working together to provide that. And the detrimental education effects during COVID have also been more acutely felt by children from poorer backgrounds with lower digital resources and less access. So again, this plays into all sorts of existing and new inequalities. Really, the point to make is that the scarring that Paul has mentioned in terms of the macro picture also applies to some of the other questions around digital skills and indeed other education skills to which I will turn now. There's a whole generation that may well suffer the long-term effects of COVID, not just in health terms, but also in educational outcome terms. So the disadvantage gap and in terms of educational outcomes and social mobility has widened in the course of COVID, and there are shorter and longer term consequences for productivity. Parents usually rely on educational settings from early years all the way through to secondary schools, were less productive during lockdown, quite naturally, but also children and teenagers have missed out on learning and on socio-emotional development, and that could have long-term scarring consequences unless we design the right interventions. And here I think it's worth starting with a few points around childcare. I mean, first of all, the impact on women in particular. You can see here how women spend much more time on childcare than men. This is children of all ages, but of course, especially under 5, then again, 5 to 10 and 11 and older. In each of these cases, women were far, far more involved during COVID than men. And that, of course, then disadvantaged them further in the labour market, besides other existing disparities, such as, for instance, career breaks during maternity leave and so on. We also have to realise that childcare costs have already increased in this country above the rate of inflation. So that's an additional problem where families, and especially, of course, single parent families, have suffered. And the impact of women is been really, really acute. So participation has fallen. Childcare costs that exceeds often family mortgage and rent payments have been a real problem. And also the fact that early years and school attendance has not yet returned to pre-pandemic levels because a number of those settings had to close and have not reopened. And part of the reason why they haven't reopened is because they didn't benefit from the support schemes that Paul touched upon in his presentation in the same way as schools and colleges did. So, for example, when we look at the early years setting, what we can see, as the next slide will show, is that early year settings didn't receive the additional funding, for instance, to do with cleaning or PPE or other things. They also had very limited access to the furlough scheme. The business rate relief and local authority discretionary grants weren't widely accessible to early year settings, and many childminders couldn't access the self-employment income support system because the applications were based on profit, not income. And, in those professions, profit, of course, is incredibly low. So these are all sorts of barriers to early years. And we know that that has long-term consequences on the productivity of those generations. We won't know for many years what it really is, but we can now guess that without further investment and intervention, there will be long-term scarring here. I want to briefly touch on learning losses. So first of all, to say that there were 4 key harms to learning and attainment for schools. So both primary and secondary school, of course, reduction in time spent learning because of school closures, reduction in the quality of work, lack of access to technology for many schools and many children, and then the impact on attainment when schools finally reopened. And the digital divide, again, has got worse, of course. Children from areas of disadvantage and from poorer income backgrounds had less access to the technology needed to engage with remote learning. And so already existing disparities have been exacerbated. And just to give you a sense of learning losses, all year groups suffered some learning losses throughout the pandemic, up to 2 months for reading and 3 months for maths. And then there are all sorts of regional differences here. Learning losses were greater in the north, and especially in the northeast and in most parts of the south, and for children from areas of disadvantage. Give you a couple of examples. Children in year 1 made approximately 3 months less progress in reading and maths compared to 2019. Children in year 2 made 3 months less progress in reading and 2 months less in maths. And the disadvantage gap is estimated between 7 and 8 months. So for the poorest, it is a lot more than even that. So that just to give you a sense of the learning losses. And this is what we project in terms of total lifetime earning losses for those generations if there aren't any more interventions and more investment. You can see it's quite considerable when we look at either the central scenario or the pessimistic one. To reiterate, nothing of this is set in stone. We invest now and intervene now, and those outcomes can be a lot better. They can be very close to the optimistic scenario if we, for instance, invest in early year settings and in the catch-up program for schools. I just want to very briefly conclude by saying that I think COVID-19 shone a light on the UK's inadequate industrial policy, both in terms of preparation and some of the early initiatives. It basically encapsulates the problem with some of the productivity policies, policy churn, silos, short-term, and also weak institutions that don't spread opportunity enough around the country. Geographically, the UK is very centralised, and functionally it's very fragmented. So there isn't enough interaction between different policy areas and government departments. The levelling up agenda is, of course, supposed to address that, and we very much welcome the ambition. And we think that in order to deliver it well, it needs a combination of funding and institution. And that's really the point on which I will conclude, which is if we are going to have serious regional regeneration, we need, first of all, a clear conceptual framework. What is the problem? Is it disparities? How exactly, what is the nature of those disparities, and how are we going to tackle them? It needs a robust institutional ecology, not just individual policy initiatives that might then be changed by the next government. It needs a long-term strategy with really transformative policies, for instance, local and regional capital markets, so that the money can really flow into, down every provincial gully and not just be concentrated in London and the Southeast. Policies on skills and policies on innovation. It has to be at scale investment. Small pots of money for certain things simply will not do, but also local design and delivery. So involving local and regional authorities in this, because otherwise we do not benefit from local knowledge, from local trust and cooperation, and it's going to be another example of failed centralism. Let me leave it there, and I look forward to all the questions and comments. Just some concluding thoughts, but I think I'll just leave them up as we go into the discussion. Tara, back to you.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for that as well. It's been brilliant to see that hugely broad overview of content that you've been able to share with us in a very, very short period of time, and the comprehensiveness of all of the thinking and analysis. There are already 3 questions for Paul, and I'll mention them in a minute. But in the meanwhile, if you've got questions for Adrian, please put them in the chat or prepare to raise your hand or something in order to bring them in. So that we can follow up on that as well. Paul, perhaps I'll summarize the questions to you, all 3 in one go, just to kind of save a little bit of time. I sort of personally think they're a little bit, both all pointing in the direction of, yes, we agree with your analysis, but could things be just a little bit better? So Chris Giles is saying, well, actually supply and demand have both surprised on the upside to date. Could the picture actually be a little bit better and the scarring a little bit lower going forward? Stephen is asking, well, if we've seen such large scarring in the UK and the US has been a bit better at reallocating labour, how come we are seeing lower inflation than them? And Bart is asking about what rates rises might do to reallocation of capital and whether that's a potential positive to look forward to in the future from a creative destruction or from a reallocation perspective. Paul, would you like to share some responses to those questions? Paul, you're on mute.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, to take Bart's first, I mean, we've been very critical with the Treasury about the fiscal policy mix because we've got very low, the bank's holding interest rates low to support demand, but we've got high inflation. So why are we worried about demand? And it's because we've got fiscal tightening of 2 to 3 points of GDP in the coming year, cyclically adjusted. Interest rates are a very broad brush to support activity. And we don't have a shortage of activity. What we have is interest rates are boosting demand in the bits of the economy that don't need it, the capital intensive bits. What needs support is the service intensive bits. Fiscal policy can be much better directed, I think. So what we should have had was higher rates, looser fiscal policy directed at the services sector, in particular directed towards reallocation. In terms of Stephen's question about the US, I think, if you look, I think the Cleveland Fed looked at why durables consumption and inflation was so high. And they said a lot of it was to do with the income boost that households got from the fiscal stimulus plans. So he gave the fiscal boost to households, not to firms, and that boosted demand for consumer durables. I think it also boosted housing. So, UK house prices are up, 8%, US is up 20%. So there's a much stronger background of demand, I think, in the US. And because the US unemployment rose quickly and then fell quickly, I think you generated a lot more speed limit effects in the US economy than in the UK. And the third question was, should we be more optimistic, from Chris? Yeah. So when we looked at our last forecast, output in 2021 was much stronger than we'd expected. But when we go forward, output growth is actually lower than we had in our previous forecast. Whereas inflation was double what we expected this year and in 2020, and will be double what we expected next year. So I think demand was more resilient, much more resilient than people expected, certainly much more resilient than we expected. And I think it was much more resilient than the government expected. And to be honest, I think that's why we've got too much fiscal tightening, because I think back in March, the government panicked because they thought there's a huge black hole in the fiscal accounts because the economy is going to be awful. And so they raised taxes, and now they found themselves with excess. And so, surprise, surprise, he's going to spend it on a pre-election income tax giveaway. So effectively, what the Chancellor will have done over the last couple of years, if we take it in sum, he will have raised tax on corporates, you could say on investment, in order to deliver, on the other hand, income tax cuts before the election. That doesn't look particularly productivity enhancing to me.
Thank you, Paul. As this discussion illustrates, there's a lot of kind of positives and negatives that every policy action brings with it. So very interesting to hear your perspectives on that, and very clear also in terms of what the recommendations would be in terms of policy instruments that would help improve that balance. We've also got a question from David Vines, really asking how the two perspectives reconcile from the bottom up or regional perspectives. Adrian showed us that productivity held up in London, but marginally fell elsewhere. And of course, professional services, financial services perhaps did continue to do fairly well here. But then, Paul, you mentioned that financial services productivity and output did really badly across the national picture, and that might be bad news for the overall economy going forward. So do you have a way of describing what might have been going on there in terms of regional versus national outcomes?
I don't. I don't. He does look contradictory, doesn't it? Yeah, I mean, financial services are down and London's up. How does that square? Well,
I suppose part of the answer may well be it depends on whether we're looking at actually output versus productivity, because from recollection, output continued to grow really fast, but that might have been because not a lot of people lost their jobs, and therefore, productivity actually didn't move very well in London despite output having held up. But Adrian, do you have a perspective on how the bottom-up picture informs the national overview?
Yes, and thank you very much for the question, David. I suppose there are at least two areas where I think the national picture relates to the regional very clearly. I mean, one is, when we look at who benefits in terms of FDI, and, it's very clear that 2/3 of all FDI activities in London and the Southeast, and just nowhere else, which suggests that it's heavily concentrated in certain parts of the country and simply not spread. And so the question is, can we build up local and regional capital markets and capital provision in a way that then would help firm birth, for example, in other parts of the country, and not just the kind of zombie firms that Paul alluded to, but of course real firms creating, real jobs, high productivity and high wage jobs that we all want to see happening across all parts of the United Kingdom. So that's one aspect. The other one is relates to what Paul said about fiscal policy. So of course, it's hugely welcome to see more public investment and more capital expenditure in the recent budget, but we wouldn't describe 3 billion on skills over 3 years as anything like a revolution. That is, I'm afraid to say, closer to a drop in the ocean, because it barely gets us back to 2010 levels in certain respects, and is simply not addressing some of the deep structural disparities that have emerged. And therefore we would say more targeted skill spending, for instance, by funding mixed colleges, because a lot of skills are hybrid. They're not purely academic, not purely vocational or technical, and in a lot of places like Grimsby and Southend and lots of places that need regeneration, those mixed colleges, we feel, with extra funding, long-term funding, so that they know what's happening, could really help build up the skills base. So there are things that can be done, short-term as well as medium and long-term. And that's, I suppose, what we're calling for, not the short-termist approach, longer-term funding, building up institutions that can provide the skills and the capital so that jobs can be created.
Thank you, Adrian. I sort of feel like you might have already answered Philip Brown's question there about what the top priorities are, certainly around FE funding and adult education and skills building, but also the institutions that go with it, so that that spending is actually targeted at the right people and is effectively delivered, which is always a necessary condition for any policy to work well. Shall I come back to Paul? There's a question from the other Paul Tucker here, around your perspectives on productivity growth going forward. So basically, in addition to looking at productivity levels, what are NISA's perspectives on what might happen to growth of productivity in the short term and then the medium term, given your sort of underlying diagnosis of what the COVID situation has delivered?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would mean that productivity might pick up somewhat, because I think there will be some incentive for people to invest to conserve labour. There will be a move away from low productivity service sectors. I mean, those sectors, hotels and restaurants, have low productivity in level terms and low productivity growth. So you've got to move towards high productivity growth industries, which are basically, if you look at the sector that did best, it was information and technology. So you've got to move towards those sectors. The sectors that generate the most productivity growth are the sectors that build the kit that everybody else uses to get faster productivity growth. It's as simple as that. If I can just come back on David's question, I think on the London versus the rest, it may be a difference between wholesale and retail. So the London may have done well out of the rise in share prices and volatility. But when you look at why the ONS came out with lower financial output for the country as a whole, it was indicators such as reduced number of visits to cash machines, for example, those sorts of things. So it's probably that retail activity, it was the retail bit of the financial sector that suffered, and London's more wholesale, I think.
Thank you, Paul. I think we're running out of time a little bit here, so perhaps we will bring it to a close. But it sounds to me like there are potentially some silver linings coming out of the COVID situation, but also a huge number of policy and indeed institutional challenges in order to really steer the economy in the right direction. And the kind of granular analysis and sort of different cuts and perspectives that NISA can bring to bear on these questions is incredibly important and will continue to be important as we move forward. So all I'd like to do is to thank Paul and Adrian, first of all, for their wonderful presentations and discussion. Thank you all for extremely interesting questions and for joining us tonight to hear what NISA has to offer on this particular topic. I hope you'll have an opportunity to join us in the future as well. And I think as a very last thing, Jachit, I was going to hand over back to you just to say some final words.
Microphone back on as a terrible fidget. I do tend to turn it off quite a lot. I was fidgeting away, but that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much, Tara, for sharing it. And I would like to follow up and have a chat with you about some of our results if I can, perhaps in the new year. Tara, meet for a New Year's drink to talk about all those things we presented. I should have said at the beginning, this work is part of Productivity Institute. I'm pleased that many members of the Productivity Institute are on this call today, as well as part of Van Ark. And we're planning to coordinate a publication of the work that Paul and Adrian have been looking after in the last few months as an occasional paper with our friends at TPI in the new year. So the discussion we've had today will feed into that and will allow us to reflect on the views that we're developing. But it's clear that the disruption that COVID has brought about will not automatically lead to a higher productivity sunlit upland. There's a lot of policy work to be thought through at the granular level. And ultimately, when you add up a lot of granular, it also means there's some aggregate policy to be thought through as well. And I think that's incredibly important. And NISA, and I would say this wouldn't I as director, but I'll say it anyway, is incredibly well placed to draw those strands together and make the arguments from the regional level and build up a picture that says, actually, we're in the wrong policy place. And that's something that we've been saying a lot this year. And it's something that I think we're going to continue to say. So governors, I was going to say, if you agree with us, help us spread our message. If you don't, come and argue with us. Come and tell us why we're wrong. I think that's incredibly important. The policy dial is in the wrong place. It's been in the wrong place for a long time, it seems to me. And if we can help get it in the right place, we'll all benefit. And ultimately, that's our job. I should therefore end. We're past the half hour. I'm going to wish you all a wonderfully merry and peaceful and restful Christmas. Enjoy your New Year celebrations legally, may I say, whatever legally means, which is probably your own conscience and your own families. But do get a rest, do enjoy yourselves, but come back ready to work with us on the problems that this country and many other countries are facing. It's an enormous agenda. It's an enormously exciting agenda, and I feel honoured to have been director at this uniquely, well, can I say uniquely? I think I will. In my lifetime anyway, uniquely difficult time facing this country since 2016. It's been a hard ride, but it's one that's been worth it. The vision that you get from sitting in the chairs at NISA is a remarkable one. It gives us freedom to talk about things that, to an extent, others cannot. So I'm grateful for all of your support and advice over the past 5.5 years, and I look forward to that continuing for some time to come. Adrian, Paul, thank you ever so much. Some brilliant presentations. We'll pick at these. Tara, thank you for being a trustee. Thank you for being a friend. And thank you for chairing today. Paul, Tucker, and Nick Crafts as well. Good evening. See you all very soon. Bye-bye.